the smell found him first. It came through the open window of the car on a Sunday evening in October, carried on the salt air of the harbor district by a breeze that had no business smelling like his childhood. The smell was garlic and rosemary and slow-braised tomatoes and something beneath those familiar notes that was specific and unmistakable. A combination of fennel seed and orange zest and the particular sweetness that develops when onions are cooked in olive oil at a temperature so low they become translucent and golden without ever browning. A technique that requires patience and attention and the understanding that the best flavors are the ones that take the longest to develop. Stefan Taviano knew that smell. Why, he knew it the way you know the sound of a voice you grew up with. Not through conscious recognition, but through the body, through the deep muscle memory of a childhood spent in a kitchen where that smell was the permanent atmosphere, the olfactory wallpaper of a home built around a stove and a table, and the belief that feeding people was the highest form of love. It was Marco's sugo, his brother's signature tomato sauce, the recipe their grandmother Julia had taught him, the recipe Marco had refined over 20 years of professional cooking until it was no longer Nonna's sugo or the family sugo, but Marco's sugo, distinctly and unmistakably his, and carrying the fingerprint of his palate and his technique and his particular understanding of how heat and time and the right ingredients in the right proportions can transform simple materials into something that makes people close their eyes when they taste it. Marco had been dead for 2 years, shot in the alley behind La Tavola di Rosa on a Tuesday night in November, killed by men who worked for Luca Provenza, whose territorial ambitions had brought him into conflict with the Taviano organization, and whose response to that conflict had been to target the one member of the family who had no involvement in the business, who had chosen the kitchen over the streets, who had spent his life making food instead of making enemies. Marco had died beside the dumpsters of his own restaurant with his chef's coat still on, and his hands still smelling of the basil he had been chopping for the evening's pesto, and the senselessness of it, the particular cruelty of killing a man whose only weapon was a kitchen knife and whose only territory was a dining room, had broken something in Stefan that had not healed, and, he believed, would never heal. He had not cooked since Marco's death. He had not entered a kitchen with the intention of preparing food. He had not touched a stove or held a knife or performed any of the thousands of small physical acts that constitute cooking, the chopping, the stirring, the tasting, the adjusting, because every one of those acts was a shared memory. It a ghost of the hundreds of hours he and Marco had spent together in the kitchen of La Tavola di Rosa, and before that in Nonna Giulia's kitchen, and before that in their mother's kitchen, 2 brothers side by side at the stove, learning the language of food that their family had spoken for generations. The restaurant had closed the week after Marco's death. Stefan had locked the doors and walked away, and had not returned. The building still stood on Via Romana in the Eastern District, a 2-story structure with the restaurant on the ground floor and Nonna Giulia's apartment above, and the sign still hung above the door, La Tavola di Rosa, in faded gold lettering. And the windows were dark, and the kitchen was cold, and the dining room, where Marco had fed 100 people every night, was empty and gathering dust, and Stefan drove past it every day and looked straight ahead and did not stop. And now, on a Sunday evening in October, 2 years after his brother's murder, the smell of Marco's sugo was drifting through the harbor district like a ghost that had found its way back to the living. Stefan told Enzo to stop the car. Enzo, who had been driving Stefan for 12 years and who knew better than to ask questions when Stefan's voice carried that particular quality of controlled intensity, pulled the car to the curb on Harbor Street and waited. Stefan sat in the back seat with the window down and breathed. The smell was coming from somewhere to the west, carried on the harbor breeze, mixed with salt and diesel and the general olfactory chaos of a waterfront neighborhood, but cutting through all of it, clear and distinct and impossible, was the sugo, not a similar sauce, not an approximation. Marco's sugo. The fennel seed and orange zest combination that was Marco's signature. The modification he had made to Nonna's recipe when he was 23, and that had become the foundation of every tomato-based dish at La Tavola di Rosa for the next 15 years. "Drive west," Stefan said. "Slowly." Enzo drove. The smell grew stronger as they moved through the narrow streets of the Harborside district, a neighborhood of converted warehouses and small apartments in the kind of businesses that exist in the margins of a port city. Ship supply shops, net menders, a laundromat, and a corner grocery with produce bins on the sidewalk. It was not Stefan's territory. The harbor side was neutral ground, too small and too poor to interest the organizations that divided the city's more profitable districts, and he had no reason to be here, had never been here, had never had cause to drive through these streets with the window down and his dead brother's cooking filling his lungs. "Stop," he said. The car was parked on a side street. To the left was a row of apartments above a marine supply shop. Behind the apartments, visible through a narrow alley, was a converted garage with its wide door rolled halfway up, and light was spilling from inside. Warm, golden, kitchen light. And the smell was pouring from the opening like a river of vapor, rich and layered and unmistakable. Stefan did not get out of the car. Ahui sat in the back seat and looked at the light and breathed the smell and felt something tear inside his chest. Not a clean tear, not the sudden rupture of acute grief, but the slow ripping of scar tissue that had formed over a wound that had never properly healed, the scar tissue of 2 years of not cooking and not eating home food, and not entering kitchens, and not allowing himself to smell the smells that were inseparable from his memory of Marco. Yara Delsanto was inside that garage. She did not know that a man was sitting in a car on the street outside, breathing in the smell of her cooking with the expression of someone witnessing a resurrection. She did not know that the recipe she was making, the sugo from page 47 of the leather journal, and the variation with fennel seed and orange zest, belonged to a dead man whose brother controlled the eastern district of the city. She knew only that the journal's recipes were extraordinary, that the person who wrote them understood food with an intimacy and a passion that matched her own, and that cooking from the journal every Sunday had become the most important thing in her week. More important than the cooking itself was the conversation she was having with the unknown author through the medium of ingredients and technique, a conversation that crossed whatever boundary separated his world from hers. She had been cooking since she was 7 years old. Her mother, Lucia, Brazilian by birth, Italian by marriage, a noblewoman whose kitchen was her parliament and whose dining table was her throne, had placed a wooden spoon in Yara's hand before Yara could read, and had taught her that food was not a chore, but a vocation, not a necessity, but an art, not something you did to survive, but something you did to make survival worth the effort. Her father, Aldo Delsanto, was second-generation Italian, a plumber by trade and a cook by passion, who spent his weekends making fresh pasta in the kitchen of the house in the Mission District where Yara grew up, rolling sheets of dough on the counter with the concentration and the care of a man who understood that the difference between good pasta and great pasta was not in the recipe, but in the hands. She had trained formally, culinary school, then stages at 3 restaurants, then a line cook position at a French bistro that taught her discipline and speed and the particular form of controlled chaos that constitutes a professional kitchen during service. She had met Thomas there, Thomas Cruz, her sous chef, her business partner, her best friend, the person who understood her relationship with food better than anyone because his relationship with food was identical, all-consuming, identity-defining, the central fact of his existence. They had opened the restaurant together. Fuego in the Mission District, a 30-seat space with an open kitchen and a menu that fused Yara's Brazilian-Italian heritage with Thomas's Mexican-Portuguese roots, creating a cuisine that was entirely their own, a culinary language spoken by two people who had grown up in kitchens on opposite sides of the world and who had discovered, are in each other, the same fluency, the same passion, the same belief that feeding people was the closest thing to prayer that two agnostic chefs could practice. Fuego had been good. Not famous, not reviewed by the important critics, not the kind of restaurant that generates waiting lists and social media attention. Good. Consistently, reliably, devotedly good. The kind of restaurant where the neighborhood came on Tuesday nights and anniversary couples came on Saturdays, and the food was always honest and always made with the full attention and the full heart of two people who cared more about the taste than the presentation, more about the experience than the reputation. The fire had ended everything. A Saturday night in January, 3 years ago. Full service, 30 covers, the kitchen at capacity, a Yara at the pass and Thomas at the fryer, and the line cooks moving in the choreographed rhythm that a kitchen develops when its team has worked together long enough to anticipate each other's movements without speaking. The grease fire started at the fryer, a spark, an accumulation of oil in the ventilation hood, a chain reaction that turned the kitchen from a workspace to an inferno in the time it took Yara to turn from the pass and see the wall of flame rising behind Tomas like a wave. She had lost the restaurant. She had lost Tomas. She had lost the skin on her right arm and the right side of her neck and 3 months of her life in the burn unit and 6 months in physical therapy and a year of learning to hold a knife again with fingers whose nerve endings had been destroyed and rebuilt and would never feel the same way they had before the fire. She had lost everything except the one thing the fire could not take, the knowledge in her hands, the muscle memory of 24 years of cooking, the understanding of heat and timing and flavor that lived in her body below the level of conscious thought, and that the fire had burned around but not through, the way a forest fire burns around a river and leaves the water untouched. She had rebuilt. Slowly, painfully, with the stubborn determination of a woman who understood that cooking was not what she did, but who she was. And that stopping would be a death more complete than the death the fire had almost given her. She had started the Sunday dinner. She had found the journal. She had built a community kitchen from a converted garage with donated equipment and thrift store plates and the kind of improvised infrastructure that would make a health inspector weep, but that produced food of such consistent quality and warmth that the 35 people who came every Sunday did not care about the code violations. They cared about the taste, and the taste was extraordinary. And the woman who produced it was scarred and fierce and unbroken and standing at a 4-burner stove in a converted garage with her sleeves rolled up and her burns showing and her wooden spoon moving through Marco Taviano's sugo with the slow, loving rhythm of someone who had found. Fought in a dead man's recipe journal, the conversation she had been missing since Thomas died. If you can already feel what that smell is doing to this man, if you know what it means to encounter someone you've lost in a place you don't expect, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales right now. Hit that notification bell because the woman behind that smell is about to change everything. He came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. He did not go inside. He did not approach the garage or look through the opening or attempt to see who was cooking. He sat in the car on the side street with the window down and breathed. And the smell washed over him and through him, and the grief that he had sealed behind walls of composure and strategy and the relentless forward motion of running an organization tore loose from its moorings and moved through him like weather. On the 3rd Sunday, Nonna Giulia called him Stefano. She was the only person alive who called him Stefano, and she said it the way she said everything, with the absolute authority of an 82-year-old Italian woman who had survived a war and a migration and the deaths of a husband and a grandson, and who regarded the world's attempts to defeat her as amusing rather than threatening. "I need you to come to the apartment." Nonna, I'm busy. You're sitting in a car on Harbor Street smelling your brother's cooking. Enzo told me. Don't be angry at Enzo, he's worried about you. Now everyone is worried about you. Come to the apartment. He went. He always went when Nonna Giulia summoned him, because refusing Nonna Giulia was like refusing gravity. Theoretically possible, but practically inadvisable, and ultimately futile. She was waiting for him in the apartment above La Tavola di Rosa. The apartment smelled of coffee and the lavender sachets she kept in every drawer, and faintly of the kitchen below. Even closed and cold for 2 years, the ghost of decades of cooking had permeated the building's walls and could not be scrubbed or aired or wished away. Nonna Giulia was small, barely 5 feet, diminished by age but not by personality. Silver hair pulled into a tight bun, sharp dark eyes that missed nothing, and hands that had made pasta and bread and sauce and every variety of Italian food for 60 years, and that were now gnarled with arthritis but still capable of producing a meal that would make a grown man weep. She sat him at the kitchen table. She placed coffee in front of him. She sat across from him and looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for family members who were being stupid, which, in her estimation, was most of the time. The woman cooking Marco's recipes is named Yara. She runs a Sunday dinner in the harbor side. Free food, anyone welcome. She's been cooking from Marco's recipe journal for 6 months. Stefan's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Marco's recipe journal. His journal. The leather one. The one he wrote in every day for 20 years. But the one that disappeared when the restaurant closed. She found it in a secondhand bookshop. She doesn't know who wrote it. She doesn't know it was Marco's. She cooks from it because the recipes are extraordinary, and because she recognizes the hand of someone who understood food the way she understands food, as a language, as a form of love, as the only reliable method of making the world less terrible than it is. How do you know all this? Because I walked to the harbor side last Sunday. Because I followed the smell, the same way you did. Because that sugo is my recipe before it was Marco's, and I would know it in a hurricane. Because I went to the garage and I sat down at one of her tables. She has tables, Stefano. She has a community dinner every Sunday. Wahambetnak Pai, she feeds 40 people from a converted garage with a 4-burner stove and a convection oven, and the kind of determination that I recognize because I had it when I was her age, and I fed a neighborhood from a kitchen the size of a closet. Because I tasted the sugo and I closed my eyes, and Marco was alive in that taste, Stefano. He was alive. Stefan looked at his grandmother. Her sharp eyes were wet. Nonna Giulia, who had not cried at Marco's funeral, who had stood at the graveside with the dry-eyed ferocity of a woman who refused to give death the satisfaction of her tears, was crying now, quietly, in her kitchen above the closed restaurant, because a stranger had cooked her grandson's recipes, and the taste had reached across death and touched her. She has scars, Nonna Giulia continued, wiping her eyes with the efficiency of someone who regards tears as a brief mechanical necessity rather than an emotional event. Burns, on her arm and her neck. From a kitchen fire, I think. She doesn't talk about it. She cooks with her sleeves rolled up and the scars visible, and she doesn't apologize for them. I like her, Stefano. I like her very much. And I think you should meet her. Why? Because you haven't cooked in 2 years. Because you haven't eaten a meal that tasted like home in 2 years. Because you drive past this restaurant every day and you don't stop. Because your brother is dead and his recipes are alive in a stranger's hands, and that is either the cruelest coincidence in the world or it is something else. And I choose to believe it is something else. Because I am 82 years old and I have earned the right to believe in things that cannot be explained. We are deep in the heart of this story now. A grandmother's grief, a brother's ghost, and a woman who cooks like she's channeling the dead. If you feel the pull, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales. Hit that like button and drop a comment, because what happens when Stefan walks into that garage is going to wreck you. Stefan spent the week in the particular form of paralysis that afflicts a man who has been told something true by someone he cannot argue with. He went to the offices on Monday morning and sat behind the desk that had been Marco's father's desk before it was his, and that still bore the ring stain from the coffee mug that Marco had placed there every morning during the years when Marco had tried, genuinely, stubbornly, lovingly tried, to work beside his brother in the family business before accepting that his hands were meant for kitchens, not ledgers, and that the organization would survive without him, but that Italian cooking would not survive without what he had to contribute to it. The desk was in the office above the warehouse on Pier 11. Stefan's days were filled with the operational mechanics of running a shipping and logistics empire whose legitimate surface concealed the deeper currents beneath. Meetings with port officials, conversations with the customs brokers who facilitated certain shipments, the careful management of relationships with the other families whose territories bordered his own. He was good at this work. He had always been good at this work. He had the temperament for it, the patience, the strategic mind, the ability to hold multiple competing interests in balance without losing sight of the larger architecture. Marco had once said that Stefan ran the organization the way a conductor runs an orchestra, with his hands, with his attention, with the understanding that every instrument matters and that the music only works when all of them are playing together. But since Marco's death, the music had gone wrong. Not in the operation. The operations continued, precise, and profitable because Stefan's discipline did not permit failure regardless of his emotional state. The wrongness was inside him, a dissonance that he carried through every meeting and every negotiation, and every evening alone in the apartment on the harbor where he lived, surrounded by the evidence of a life that had been built for two brothers and was now occupied by one. Marco's coat still hung in the hallway closet. Marco's boots were by the door, the second bedroom, the room Marco had stayed in during the years before the restaurant, when both brothers had lived together in the easy, argumentative, profoundly loyal cohabitation of siblings who genuinely liked each other, was unchanged. Stefan had not entered it in 2 years. The door was closed. Behind it, Marco's books and Marco's clothes and the chef's knives that Stefan had retrieved from the restaurant after Marco's death sat in the still air of a room that had become a tomb. Enzo, his driver, and the closest thing Stefan had to a confidant, had watched the transformation with the quiet concern of a man who had known both brothers since childhood. Enzo had driven Marco to the restaurant every morning, and Enzo had been the one to receive the phone call. Enzo had been the one to drive Stefan to the hospital and to stand in the corridor while Stefan identified the body, and to drive him home afterward in a silence that had never fully lifted. "You could just go in," Enzo said on Tuesday, watching Stefan in the rearview mirror during the morning drive to Pier 11, to the garage, to the Sunday dinner. You could sit down and eat like a normal person instead of sitting in the car, breathing like a man having a heart attack. "Drive, Enzo." "I'm driving. I'm also talking. These are not mutually exclusive activities." Marco would have gone in. Marco would have walked through that door on the first Sunday and introduced himself and eaten 3 bowls of pasta and told the woman her sugo needed more basil. That's what Marco would have done. "I'm not Marco." "No, you are not. Marco was the one who knew how to be a person. You are the one who knows how to be a boss. Both are useful. Being a person is more useful right now." Stefan said nothing. Enzo drove. The city moved past the windows. The docks, the warehouses, the harbor district where the smell of salt and diesel mingled with the ghost of Marco's cooking that Stefan could not stop seeking, could not stop circling, could not bring himself to approach, because approaching meant acknowledging that his brother's recipes were alive in a stranger's hands, and that Marco was both gone and present, and that the grief Stefan had sealed in a locked room inside his chest was leaking through the walls. On Wednesday, he stood in the apartment hallway and looked at Marco's closed door. On Thursday, he placed his hand on the doorknob and held it for 11 minutes without turning it. On Friday, he opened the door and stood in the threshold and looked at Marco's room. The unmade bed, the books on Italian cooking stacked on the nightstand, the chef's knives in their leather roll on the desk, the framed photograph of both brothers in Nonna Giulia's kitchen at ages 12 and 7, flour on their faces and their hands deep in pasta dough, and their expressions identically serious because Nonna had told them that pasta making was not a game, but a sacrament, and both boys had believed her. He closed the door. He went to the harbor. He sat in the car on the side street and breathed the ghost of Marco's Sugo, and the grief moved through him like a tide, in coming in and going out and leaving traces on the shore that would never fully wash away. He went on a Sunday, not in the car with Enzo. He walked alone through the harborside streets in the early evening light, wearing dark jeans and a black shirt and no jacket, no armor, nothing that announced who he was or what he controlled. He walked because Nonna Giulia had told him to walk, because you can't arrive at a woman's table in a car with a driver, Stefano. You arrive on your feet like a person who is hungry and humble and willing to sit down with strangers. The garage was at the end of a narrow alley behind a row of apartments. The wide door was rolled up, and inside was a space that had been transformed from a parking bay into a kitchen and dining room with the resourceful ingenuity of someone who understands that cooking does not require a professional setup. It requires heat and ingredients and hands and the will to feed people. There was a 4-burner stove against the back wall, connected to a gas line with the kind of improvised plumbing that a building inspector would not have approved. But that functioned perfectly. A stainless steel prep table, a convection oven, open shelving stacked with plates and bowls and glasses, none matching, all collected from thrift shops and donations, and 4 long folding tables arranged in a U-shape, covered in checked tablecloths with mismatched chairs and benches and even a few overturned crates serving as seats. 35 people were eating. Our families with children, elderly couples, single men who looked like they had come from the docks, women from the neighborhood with covered dishes they had brought to contribute, a group of teenagers who were eating with the focused intensity of people who were genuinely hungry. They were eating from large serving bowls placed in the center of each table. Pasta with a tomato sauce that Stefan could smell from the alley, and that made his hands shake and his eyes sting because it was Marco's Sugo, unmistakable, perfect, alive. And there at the stove was the woman. She was not what he expected. He had expected, what? A professional chef, perhaps, someone polished and deliberate, someone whose kitchen would reflect the precision of a trained culinary mind. What he saw was a woman in a worn leather apron and a dark t-shirt with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her thick brown hair pulled back in a messy bun, her brown eyes focused on a pot, with the concentration of someone who cooks, not for show but for survival, for the survival of the people she feeds, and for her own survival, because cooking was the thing that kept her tethered to the world, and she held on to it with both hands. He saw the scars, the burn scarring that covered her right arm from elbow to wrist and climbed the right side of her neck, ridged, textured, pink and white against her brown skin, the permanent record of a fire that had taken something from her and left something in its place. She wore the scars without concealment, without apology, and without the self-conscious covering that most people with visible scarring adopt. She wore them the way she wore her apron, as part of who she was, as evidence of what she had survived, as proof that the fire had taken a restaurant and a colleague, in the use of the nerve endings in her right forearm, but had not taken the one thing that mattered, her ability to cook. She was stirring the sugo. Her left hand, the unburned hand, held a wooden spoon and moved it through the sauce with the slow, circular motion that Marco had used, the motion that Nonna Giulia had taught both boys, the motion that distributes heat evenly and prevents the sauce from sticking, and that cannot be learned from a cookbook because it is not a technique but a rhythm. a frequency that the body learns from standing beside someone who knows it and absorbing the movement through proximity rather than instruction. Stefan stood at the entrance of the garage and watched a stranger cook his dead brother's recipe with his dead brother's rhythm and felt the world rearrange itself around a new axis. She looked up. She saw a tall man standing in the entrance. Broad, dark-haired, with the kind of face that looks like it was carved from something harder than flesh, all angles and shadows, and the deep-set, dark eyes of someone who has not slept properly in a very long time. He was staring at her stove with an expression she could not immediately read. Not hunger, not curiosity, but something raw, something that looked like recognition, as if the pot of sauce on her burner contained something he had lost. Sit down, she said, gesturing to an empty space at the nearest table. There's plenty. He did not sit down. He walked toward the stove, and the people at the tables watched him. This large, intense stranger who moved through the garage with the deliberate grace of someone who was accustomed to commanding space. And Yara felt a flicker of something that was not fear but awareness. The heightened attention that a woman alone in a semi-public space develops when a large, unfamiliar man approaches with purpose. He stopped at the stove. He looked at the pot of sugo. He looked at the prep table beside the stove, where the ingredients were laid out in the organized array that professional kitchens call mise en place. The fennel seeds in a small bowl, the orange zest on a cutting board, the onions already sweating in a pan of olive oil at the precise low temperature that turns them golden without browning. "Where did you learn this recipe?" he asked, and his voice was steady, but his hands were not. Yara looked at his face. She looked at his trembling hands. She looked at the way he was staring at the mise en place with the expression of someone seeing a photograph of a place they used to live. "A journal," she said. "A recipe journal I found in a bookshop on Fleet Street, handwritten, leather-bound. Whoever wrote it was a genius. The recipes they're not just recipes, they're conversations. The person who wrote them was talking to the food, explaining what they wanted, negotiating with the ingredients. Now I've been cooking from it for 6 months, and every recipe teaches me something I didn't know." "The sugo," Stefan said. "The fennel and orange zest." "That's from page 47. The note beside it says, 'Nonna's base plus my additions. She'll complain, but she'll eat 3 bowls.'" There are notes like that throughout the journal. The person who wrote it was funny and brilliant and clearly loved by someone named Rosa, because half the recipes are tagged "for the table of Rosa." Stefan closed his eyes. He pressed his hand against his mouth and breathed through his fingers, and the smell of the sugo surrounded him. And Marco was there, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a presence encoded in the chemistry of fennel and orange and slow-cooked tomatoes, and a presence that this woman had summoned from a recipe journal without knowing whose voice she was channeling. "Are you okay?" Yara asked. Her voice had shifted. The brisk, practical tone of a woman running a community kitchen, replaced by something softer, the tone she used with the elderly diners who sometimes cried over their food because it reminded them of people and places they had lost. "The man who wrote that journal was my brother," Stefan said. "His name was Marco Taviano. He was a chef. He ran a restaurant called La Tavola di Rosa, named after our grandmother. He was killed 2 years ago. That journal was his life's work. I thought it was lost." The garage was quiet. 35 people had stopped eating and were watching the tall man at the stove and the scarred woman beside him. And the silence had the particular quality of a room full of people who are witnessing something they do not fully understand, but that they can feel is important. Yara set down the wooden spoon. She untied her apron. She reached under the prep table and pulled out the journal. Leather-bound, well-worn, the pages soft, from years of kitchen use and 6 months of Yara's handling, and she held it out to him. "It's yours," she said. "It was always yours." I should have tried harder to find who it belonged to. Stefan looked at the journal. Marco's journal. The leather cover that Marco's hands had touched every day for 20 years. The pages where Marco had written his recipes in the slanting handwriting that Stefan knew as well as his own. The book that contained his brother's voice encoded in ingredient lists and cooking temperatures, and the personal notes that made the recipes more than instructions, that made them letters, conversations, a one-sided dialogue with the people Marco had fed, and the food Marco had loved, and the life Marco had built from flour and fire, and the stubborn belief that a good meal could fix anything. He did not take the journal. He placed his hand over Yara's hand, the hand holding the journal, and he pressed gently, pushing the book back toward her. "Keep it," he said. "You're the one cooking from it." Marco would have wanted that. Marco would have wanted his recipes in the hands of someone who understood them. "I can't keep your brother's journal." "You already have it. You've been cooking his food for 6 months. You've been feeding people his recipes. You've been keeping him alive in a way that I couldn't. I haven't cooked since he died. I can't. The kitchen was his place and mine, and without him it's just a room with knives. But you found his voice in a secondhand bookshop, and you brought it back to life. Keep the journal. Cook from it. That's what it was made for." Yara looked at the man in front of her. This large, grief-hollowed stranger whose trembling hands and closed eyes and pressed mouth told her everything she needed to know about the cost of losing the person who wrote those recipes. She looked at the journal in her hands. She looked at the pot of sugo on the stove, still simmering, still filling the garage with the smell that had brought this man to her door. "Sit down," she said again. "Aim but differently this time. Not the brisk instruction of a cook directing a diner, but the quiet invitation of a woman who recognized grief because she carried her own. Eat. That's what he would have wanted, right? That's what the journal says on every other page. Feed them. Feed them well. Feed them until they remember that the world is not entirely terrible." Stefan sat down. Yara served him a bowl of pasta with Marco's sugo, the sauce ladled generously over fresh pappardelle she had made that morning, the fennel and orange zest singing through the tomato base, the whole dish radiating the warmth and the care and the particular genius of a man who had been dead for 2 years, but whose recipes refused to stay buried. Stefan picked up the fork. He twirled the pasta. He brought it to his mouth. He tasted his brother's cooking for the first time in 2 years, prepared by a stranger's scarred hands in a converted garage in the Harbor District, and the taste was so precisely, devastatingly correct, so perfectly Marco, that the fork stopped halfway back to the bowl, and he sat at the folding table surrounded by 35 strangers and pressed his hand over his eyes and wept. Yara did not comfort him. She did not touch him or speak to him or offer the well-meaning but useless words that people offer when they witness someone else's grief. She went back to the stove and continued cooking, giving him the privacy of her turned back and the cover of kitchen sounds, the bubbling of sauce, the clatter of plates, the murmur of conversation resuming around him as the other diners, understanding that the man at the table needed space. Aim returned to their own meals and their own conversations and left him alone with his brother's food and his brother's ghost. The drive home was silent. Enzo did not ask what had happened. He had watched Stefan walk to the garage and disappear inside, and emerge 90 minutes later with red-rimmed eyes and the particular set to his jaw that Enzo recognized as the expression Stefan wore when something had broken through his defenses, and he was rebuilding them in real time, brick by brick, mortaring the walls back into place with sheer will. "Don't say anything," Stefan said. "I wasn't going to." "You were composing something. I can tell. Your shoulders do a thing when you're about to deliver one of your observations." "My shoulders are merely driving the car, boss. Whatever they do is between them and God." Stefan almost smiled. It was the closest he had come to smiling in 2 years, and the almost smile hurt more than the weeping had, because it reminded him that his face still knew how to make that shape, and that Marco had been the person who most reliably caused it, and that Marco was dead, and the woman who cooked Marco's sugo was alive, and his face was confused about which fact to respond to. The week that followed was different from every other week in the 2 years since Marco's death, and the difference was this: Stefan had something to wait for. The meetings continued, the operations ran, the port schedules were managed, and the relationships maintained, and the careful architecture of a criminal empire kept in balance. But underneath the routine, beneath the discipline, Stefan was counting days until Sunday. He caught himself doing it on Wednesday. Caught the thought that in 4 days he would eat Marco's food again, taste Marco's recipes, sit in the converted garage where the smell of his brother's cooking permeated the walls. And the thought was so unfamiliar, so fundamentally different from the flat line of the previous 2 years, that he stopped in the middle of a sentence during a meeting with the Port Authority and stared at the wall for long enough that 3 men in suits exchanged nervous glances. On Thursday, he went to the Italian grocery on Fifth Avenue, the one where Marco had shopped, the one where the owner, an elderly Calabrese named Signor Procopio, still kept Marco's standing order on file because he could not bring himself to delete it, and he bought fennel seeds. He did not know why. He held the small jar in his hand, and the smell that escaped when he opened the lid was the smell of Marco's sugo, and the smell of Nonna Giulia's kitchen, and the smell of 35 strangers eating together in a converted garage. And he bought the fennel seeds and took them home and placed them on the kitchen counter in his apartment and looked at them for a very long time. On Saturday, he opened Marco's door again. This time he went inside. He sat on Marco's unmade bed and picked up the book on the nightstand, Marcella Hazan's Essentials of Classic Italian Cooking. The spine cracked, the pages marked with post-it notes in Marco's handwriting. And he held the book the way a person holds a letter from someone who has died, with both hands and with care, and with the understanding that the object contains something of the person who touched it last. He came back the next Sunday. He sat at the same table. He ate the same pasta. And when the other diners had gone and Yara was cleaning the garage, wiping the tables, washing the pots, storing the leftover food in containers for the elderly neighbors who couldn't come to the dinner, he stayed and helped. He carried the folding tables to the wall. He stacked the chairs. He swept the concrete floor with a broom that was missing half its bristles and that Yara wielded like a weapon, attacking the floor with the physical intensity of someone who channels emotion through labor. They did not talk much that first cleaning, or the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had each lost something to violence and fire, and who understood that words are not always the appropriate response to shared understanding. He swept. She washed. The garage emptied and the evening cooled, and the smell of Marco's cooking lingered in the air the way the smell of incense lingers in a church, holy, persistent, infused into the walls. He noticed things. He noticed that she hummed while she cleaned. Low, tuneless, the sound of someone whose body makes music unconsciously, while their mind is occupied with the physical task. He noticed that she rinsed every dish twice, once with soapy water and once with clean, and that she dried them with a cloth rather than leaving them on a rack, because water spots on plates are the sign of a kitchen that doesn't care, and this kitchen cares. He noticed that the burn scars on her right arm changed color in the cold, the ridged tissue going pale where the surrounding skin flushed pink, and that she did not adjust her sleeves or hide the change, because hiding implied shame, and Yara did not carry shame about the fire. She carried grief. She carried loss. She carried the permanent absence of Thomas and the permanent presence of her scars. But she did not carry shame, and the distinction was important, and Stefan recognized it because he carried the same distinction about Marco. The grief without shame, the loss without regret. The understanding that the terrible thing that happened was terrible, but was not his fault, and did not diminish who he was. He noticed that she locked the garage with 2 padlocks and a chain, the precaution of a woman who worked alone in a semi-industrial neighborhood at night and who understood that the world contains dangers that cooking cannot fix. He noticed that she walked home alone, east along the Harbor Road, and that her apartment was 7 blocks from the garage in a building that looked like it had been converted from a warehouse with external stairs and a metal door and the particular utilitarian architecture of a space that was built for storage and adapted for living. He noticed that she stopped at the corner of Harbor Road and 3rd Street and looked back at the garage, the way a person looks back at a place they love before leaving it for the night, and that the expression on her face in that backward glance was not fatigue or satisfaction, but something closer to gratitude. The gratitude of someone who has found, after destruction, a reason to stand at a stove and cook, and who does not take that reason for granted because she knows what it costs to lose it. On the 3rd Sunday, she talked. She told him about the fire. 3 years ago, at the restaurant she had co-owned with her sous chef, Tomas, in the Mission District on the other side of the city. A grease fire that started on the line during a Saturday night service and spread faster than anyone could respond. Fed by the ventilation system, accelerated by years of accumulated grease in the hood, and turning the kitchen into an inferno in less than 90 seconds, she had been at the pass when it started, expediting orders, and she had turned toward the line and seen the wall of flame, and she had done what her training and her instincts demanded. She had pushed 2 line cooks toward the back exit, and she had reached through the fire to pull Thomas away from the fryer where he had frozen, where the shock had locked his muscles and his legs would not move, and the fire had caught her arm and her neck, and she had screamed and pulled, and Thomas had not moved, and the ceiling had collapsed, and she had been dragged out by a dishwasher named Felix, who had grabbed her by the back of her jacket and hauled her into the alley and saved her life. Thomas had died. The restaurant had burned to its skeleton. Yara had spent 3 months in the burn unit and 6 months in physical therapy, and a year rebuilding the nerve function in her right arm to the point where she could hold a knife again, not with the same precision as before, not with the same speed, but with enough control to cook. And cooking was all she needed. Cooking was the only thing she had left. Cooking was the language she spoke, and the country she lived in, and the reason she got out of bed in the morning. She had started the Sunday dinner 6 months after the fire, a small thing at first, cooking for her neighbors in the harbor side, the elderly couples and the single mothers and the dock workers who lived in the apartments around her and who ate fast food and microwave meals because they were too tired or too poor or too alone to cook for themselves. Or she had set up a table in the alley behind her apartment and cooked rice and beans and whatever she could afford, and the word had spread, and the table had become 2 tables and then 4, and the alley had become the garage, and the handful of neighbors had become 35 regulars who came every Sunday because the food was good and free, and because sitting at Yara's table felt like something that most of them had lost and didn't know they missed: family. "I found Marco's journal in a bookshop on Fleet Street," she said, drying the last pot. "I wasn't looking for a recipe book. I was looking for something else. I don't know what. Something that spoke to me the way Thomas used to speak to me about food, the way my mother spoke to me about food, the way food people talk to each other about the thing they love." I opened the journal and I read the first recipe, the sugo, page 1, the base recipe before the fennel and orange variation, and I knew. I knew the way you know when you taste something extraordinary. This was a person who understood food the way I understand food. This was a person I wanted to cook with. The fact that they weren't alive to cook with didn't change that. Their recipes were alive. Their voice was in the ingredients. "I've been having a conversation with your brother for 6 months, Stefan. Every Sunday, through the food." Stefan listened. He stood in the cleaned garage with the evening air coming through the open door and the last traces of sugo fading from the air, and he listened to this woman, this scarred, fierce, brilliant woman who cooked his dead brother's recipes in a converted garage for strangers, describe a relationship with Marco that was impossible and real and sustained entirely through the medium of food. And he felt something shift in the locked room inside his chest where he kept his grief, a door cracking open, letting in a draft of air that smelled like garlic and rosemary, and the kitchen where he had grown up. He would have loved this place, Stefan said. Marco would have loved this garage and these tables and these people. He would have said, "This is what food is for, Steph. Not the fancy restaurant, not the reviews, not the reservations. This, feeding people who are hungry. That's the whole point." "That is the whole point," Yara said. "Everything else is decoration." The Sundays continued. Stefan came every week, not as a diner, not as a guest, but as help. He carried supplies from his car. He set up the tables. He peeled garlic and chopped onions and performed the prep work that every kitchen requires. And that is the most meditative part of cooking, the repetitive physical labor that occupies the hands and frees the mind. He was cooking. He did not realize it at first. He was so focused on helping, on being useful, on the physical proximity to food preparation that was simultaneously painful and necessary. But by the fourth Sunday, he was standing beside Yara at the stove, stirring the sugo with the same wooden spoon she used, and the motion of his hand, the slow circular rhythm that Nonna Julia had taught him and Marco, the rhythm that Yara had absorbed from Marco's journal, was identical to Yara's motion, and they stirred together in a synchrony that was unconscious and complete, two people speaking the same culinary language, learned from different sources but converging at the same stove. Yara noticed. She looked at his hands. Large, sure, moving with the muscle memory of someone who had been trained in a kitchen before they were trained in anything else. And she said, "You cook." "I used to cook, with Marco, in our restaurant, in Nonna's kitchen before that. I haven't cooked since he died." "You're cooking now." He looked at the wooden spoon in his hand. He looked at the sauce in the pot. He looked at the mise en place on the prep table, the fennel seeds, the orange zest, the sweating onions, and he realized that she was right. He was cooking. His hands were performing the acts that he had sealed away for 2 years, the physical vocabulary of a life he had shared with Marco, and the acts did not destroy him. They hurt. The ghost of Marco standing beside him at the stove was vivid and painful, but they did not destroy him, because Marco's ghost was not alone. Yara was there, her scarred arm reaching across the prep table for the salt, her brown eyes checking the sauce's consistency, her presence filling the space that Marco had left, not replacing him, never replacing him, but occupying the emptiness in a way that made it bearable. My sous chef, Tomas, used to say that cooking is the only honest conversation, Yara said. You can't lie with food. The ingredients tell the truth. The heat tells the truth. The taste tells the truth. Every meal is a confession. What's this meal confessing? She looked at the pot of sugo. She looked at the journal. And open on the prep table to page 47, Marco's slanting handwriting visible in the steam. She looked at Stefan, standing beside her at the stove with a wooden spoon in his hand and his brother's recipe in the pot and 2 years of sealed grief cracking open in the heat of the kitchen. That some things survive, she said. The fire took my restaurant and my partner. The bullet took your brother. But the recipes survived. The journal survived. The knowledge survived. The hands remember what the heart tries to forget. That's what this meal is confessing. That loss is not the end of the story. It's the middle. The 5th Sunday, Nonna Julia came. She arrived in the way that Nonna Julia arrived everywhere, without warning, without apology, and with the absolute expectation that her presence would be welcomed because her presence was, by definition, a gift. Enzo had driven her, because Nonna Julia did not walk to the harbor side anymore. Her knees would not permit it. But she had walked from the car to the garage under her own power, refusing Enzo's offered arm with a glare that communicated her position on assistance. She would ask for it when she needed it, and anyone who assumed she needed it before she asked was committing an act of disrespect that she would remember and potentially avenge. She walked into the garage during the dinner service when all 4 tables were full and the steam from the stove was thick and warm and the noise of 38 people eating together. The regulars, plus a handful of new faces who had heard about the Sunday dinner from neighbors, filled the space with the particular music of communal eating, forks against plates, eye conversation, laughter, the sound of a ladle striking the inside of a pot. She walked past the tables and the diners and the mismatched chairs, and she went directly to the stove, where Yara was plating a secondary course, a fennel and citrus salad from page 63 of Marco's journal. And she stood beside the scarred woman who was cooking her grandson's recipes, and she looked at the pot of sugo, and she looked at the salad, and she looked at the journal open on the prep table, and she said, "You oversalted the water." Yara turned to see a tiny, silver-haired woman with the sharpest eyes she had ever encountered, standing at her elbow, with the posture of a queen and the expression of a food critic who has found a flaw and intends to address it. "The water is fine, Yara said. "The water is oversalted. I can tell from the color of the foam. When Marco made this recipe, when I taught Marco to make this recipe, the water was salted like the sea, not like the Dead Sea. You are generous with salt. Generosity is a virtue in a person and a flaw in a cook. Reduce the salt by 1/3. Yara looked at this woman. She looked at the pot. She looked at Stefan, who had stopped mid-chop at the prep table and was watching the exchange with an expression that combined alarm and amusement in equal measure. "You're Nonna Giulia," Yara said. "I am Giulia Taviano. I am Marco's grandmother. I am Stefan's grandmother. I am the person who taught both of those boys to cook, and I am telling you that your salt is too heavy. This is not a criticism. This is an education." Yara put down the ladle. She tasted the water. She considered. Or she adjusted the seasoning of the next batch, and something passed between the two women. A recognition, a mutual respect, the understanding that they were both women who had built their lives around feeding people and who took the act of cooking with the seriousness it deserved. Nonna Giulia stayed for the entire dinner. She sat at the head of the nearest table, a position she assumed without being directed to it, because Nonna Giulia did not wait for direction, she provided it. And she ate 2 bowls of pasta and the fennel salad and a piece of bread that Yara had baked that morning, and she declared the bread acceptable, which from me is a compliment, so write it down. She spoke with every diner at the table. She learned their names, their occupations, their family situations. She told Mrs. Delacroix, Ana Afiahaki, an elderly Haitian woman who came every Sunday with her granddaughter, that the scarf she was wearing was beautiful, and where did she get it, and could she get one for Giulia, because the harbor wind was murder on an old woman's neck. She told the teenagers from the docks that they should eat more slowly, because food prepared with this much care deserved the respect of attention. After the dinner, when the diners had gone and the cleanup was underway, Nonna Giulia stood in the middle of the empty garage and looked around, at the folding tables, the mismatched chairs, the 4-burner stove, the open shelving with its collection of thrift store plates, and she said to Stefan, "This is what La Tavola di Rosa was supposed to be, not the restaurant. The restaurant was beautiful, but it was a business. This is what Rosa meant. A table for everyone. Your grandmother Rosa, my daughter-in-law, she always said the restaurant should have been free. She said charging people for food was like charging them for air. She was impractical, and she was right. This woman is doing what Rosa dreamed of." She turned to Yara, who was wiping down the stove with the concentrated attention of someone who cleans the way she cooks. Thoroughly, without shortcuts, with respect for the equipment. "You will come to my apartment on Wednesday," Nonna Giulia said. It was not a question. It was not an invitation. It was a summons issued by a woman who had been summoning people for 8 decades and who had never once been refused. "I will teach you the recipes that are not in the journal, The ones Marco didn't write down because they were in his hands, not in his head. The ones that have to be taught standing at the stove, shoulder to shoulder, the way I taught Marco and the way my mother-in-law Rosa taught me. Wednesday, 2 o'clock. Bring nothing. I have everything we need. Yara looked at Stefan. Stefan shrugged. The shrug of a man who had spent 43 years living under Nonna Giulia's authority, and who understood that resistance was not merely futile, but philosophically misguided. Wednesday, Yara said. Wednesday, Nonna Giulia confirmed. And she walked out of the garage with the dignified, unhurried pace of a woman who had just arranged the world to her satisfaction and saw no reason to rush away from her own handiwork. The Wednesday sessions became a fixture. Yara went to the apartment above La Tavola di Rosa every Wednesday at 2 o'clock and stood beside Nonna Giulia at the stove and learned the recipes that existed only in Giulia's hands. The handmade pasta whose dough had to be felt, not measured, the braised rabbit whose timing depended on the sound of the pot, the bread dough that had to be kneaded until it breathes back at you, child, like a living thing. She learned the history of each recipe. Which ones came from Rosa? Which ones came from Giulia's mother in Calabria? Which ones were Marco's inventions that Giulia had initially rejected and subsequently adopted, with the grudging admission that the boy had talent, which he inherited from me, not from his mother, who could burn water, and Stefan, who had not entered La Tavola di Rosa since Marco's death. I began to come on Wednesdays too, not to the restaurant below. He was not ready for the restaurant, not ready for the kitchen where Marco had spent his life, but to the apartment above, where Nonna Giulia and Yara cooked and argued and tasted, and the apartment filled with the smell of food and the sound of two strong women debating the correct consistency of risotto. And Stefan sat at the kitchen table and watched, and the locked door in his chest opened a little wider with each visit, letting in the warmth and the steam and the possibility that a kitchen could be a place of living rather than a museum of the dead. Stefan looked at this woman, scarred, strong, unbroken, standing at a 4-burner stove in a converted garage, feeding 35 strangers his dead brother's food. And he felt the locked door in his chest swing fully open, and what came through was not just grief, but something wider, something that had room inside it for the past and the present and the slim, tentative, fennel-scented possibility of a future. By the 7th Sunday, the community had noticed. The regulars, Mrs. Delacroix with her granddaughter Celine, old Dermot from the docks who came every week in the same wool cap and ate 3 bowls and never spoke, the group of teenagers who had started coming the 2nd month and who now helped set up the tables without being asked, had watched the transformation with the particular attentiveness of people who eat together every week and who notice when the chemistry of the room changes. They noticed that the tall, quiet man who had wept over his first bowl of pasta now stood at the stove beside Yara with the ease of someone who belonged there. Or they noticed that the food had changed, not in quality, which had always been extraordinary, but in range, because Stefan was contributing recipes from Nonna Giulia's repertoire that were not in Marco's journal, dishes he remembered from childhood, and the menu on any given Sunday now carried the combined knowledge of 3 generations of Taviano cooks filtered through the hands of a Brazilian-Italian woman who added her own instincts to every dish she touched. They noticed, too, the way Stefan and Yara moved around each other in the small kitchen, the choreography of 2 people who have learned each other's spatial rhythms, who know when to step left and when to reach right, and when to hand a spoon without being asked. It was the dance of a professional kitchen, the wordless cooperation that develops between cooks who share a space long enough to become extensions of each other's movements, and the regulars watched it and understood something that Stefan and Yara had not yet said to each other, that this was not merely a working partnership. This was a conversation conducted in motion, in proximity, in the shared heat of a stove, in the shared act of feeding strangers, and the conversation was saying something that neither of them had the words for yet. He kissed her on a Sunday in December. Not in the garage. The garage was for cooking, for community, for the sacred work of feeding people, but outside, in the alley, and after the tables were folded and the pots were washed and the leftovers were distributed, and the garage door was pulled down and the evening was cold and dark and smelled of salt air and the last traces of Marco's sugo. He kissed her carefully, mindful of the scars on her neck, his large hand cupping the unscarred side of her face with a gentleness that surprised them both. The gentleness of a man who had spent his life controlling territory and who was now touching a woman's face with the same reverence he had once brought to handling a perfect piece of fish, the understanding that what he held was valuable and perishable and deserved the best of his attention. As she kissed him back with the warmth and the directness and the honesty of a woman who had been through fire and come out the other side with her hands intact and her heart open and her absolute refusal to waste time on anything that was not real. She kissed him the way she cooked, with her whole self, without reservation, with the understanding that the best things in life are the ones you commit to completely. Marco's journal stays in the garage, she said when they pulled apart. It belongs to the Sunday dinner. It belongs to the people who eat here. Agreed. And you're going to cook with me, every Sunday. You're going to stand at that stove and make your brother's recipes, and you're going to feed people, and you're going to remember that the kitchen is not a graveyard, Stefan. It's a garden. Things grow there, even after everything burns. He looked at her. This woman who had found his brother's voice in a secondhand bookshop and brought it back to life in a converted garage, and who was now standing in an alley in the harbor district telling a Mafia boss how to grieve. And he understood that Nonna Giulia had been right. This was not a coincidence. This was something else, something that could not be explained by strategy or calculation or the rational mechanics of a world that Stefan had spent his life organizing and controlling. Something that could only be explained by the irrational, uncontrollable, deeply human truth that love, the love of food, the love of family, the love of feeding people, is stronger than fire, and stronger than bullets, and stronger than the grief that follows when both have taken everything except the recipes and the hands that know how to cook them. Every Sunday, he said. Every Sunday. She took his hand, the scarred hand taking the unscarred one, and they stood in the alley in the cold December air and held on to each other with the grip of two people who have each learned what it means to lose everything and who understand that what they are holding now is not a guarantee, but a chance, and that chances, like good ingredients, must be treated with care and attention and the willingness to commit. I want to reopen La Tavola di Rosa, Stefan said. Yara looked at him. The words had come from somewhere he had not expected. Not from the strategic mind that ran the organization, not from the careful planner who weighed every decision against its consequences, but from the part of him that had stood in Nonna Giulia's kitchen on Wednesdays, watching Yara learn the recipes that only existed in his grandmother's hands, and had felt, for the first time in 2 years, the pull of a future that contained something other than loss. Not as a restaurant, he continued, not as a business, as an extension of this, the Sunday dinner, a community kitchen with a real kitchen, Marco's kitchen, with his equipment and his stove and his prep tables, free meals, open tables, the thing Nonna said Rosa always wanted, a table for everyone. Yara was quiet. She looked at the alley, at the closed garage door, while at the harbor, lights reflecting on the water in the distance. She thought about Fuego, about the restaurant she had built and lost, about the 30-seat space in the Mission District that had been her life's work, and that the fire had reduced to a skeleton of charred beams and melted steel. She thought about Thomas, who had stood at the fryer on that Saturday night in January, and who had frozen and who had died because the fire was faster than Yara's hands, and she thought about how she had rebuilt, not in a restaurant, but in a garage, not for profit, but for community, not with a sous chef, but alone. And she thought about how Marco's journal had given her back the thing the fire had taken, a conversation with another cook, a shared language, a partnership conducted across the boundary of death through the medium of recipes. La tavola di Rosa, she said. A table for Rosa. A table for everyone, but named for Rosa, because she understood before any of us that feeding people is not a business. It's a vocation. You'd need to renovate the kitchen. It's been closed for 2 years. I'll renovate the kitchen. You need health inspections, permits, a proper commercial setup. The garage works because it's small and informal, but a real kitchen needs real infrastructure. I have resources. You'd need a chef. I have a chef. She's standing in an alley arguing logistics with me instead of agreeing to the best idea I've had in 2 years. Yara almost laughed. It was not quite a laugh. It was the exhale that precedes a laugh, the body's recognition that something is both absurd and true. That a mafia boss is standing in a harbor alley, proposing to reopen his dead brother's restaurant as a free community kitchen, staffed by a scarred chef who learned to cook his brother's recipes from a journal she found in a secondhand bookshop, and that the proposal is simultaneously the most irrational and the most right thing she has heard in 3 years. Nonna Julia will want to be involved, Yara said. Nonna Julia will run the entire operation within a week. She'll reorganize the kitchen, retrain the volunteers, and criticize the salt levels of every dish. This is a certainty. I like her salt criticism. She's usually right. Don't tell her that. Her ego is already the size of a continent. If she discovers you agree with her about the salt, she'll be impossible. She's already impossible. That's why she's magnificent. Stefan looked at Yara in the December darkness and felt something he had not felt in so long that he had forgotten the name for it. Hope. Not the abstract, philosophical hope of a man who intellectually acknowledges that the future exists. Real hope. Specific hope. The hope of a man who can see the next Sunday and the Sunday after that, and the Wednesday cooking sessions, and the renovation of a kitchen, and the reopening of a restaurant, and a woman with scarred hands and brown eyes, and the absolute refusal to let fire or grief or loss have the final word. Marco's journal stays in the kitchen, Yara said. Open, on the prep table, where everyone can see it, where everyone who cooks there knows whose recipes they're making and why the food matters and what it costs to create something this good. Agreed. And the Sunday dinner continues, every Sunday. Open tables, free meals, the garage and the restaurant both, because the garage is where this started, and you don't abandon your origins when something better comes along. You expand. You grow. You keep the roots, and you let the branches reach. You sound like Nonna. That is the highest compliment anyone has ever paid me, and I will be accepting it without false modesty. They walked back to the garage. Yara unlocked the door and rolled it up and turned on the lights, and the space that had been a community kitchen an hour ago was now empty and clean and waiting, and Stefan stepped inside, into a kitchen, and into the smell of residual cooking, into the physical space of food preparation that he had avoided for 2 years. And he stood at the stove and placed his hand on the burner knob and turned on the flame and watched it bloom blue and orange beneath the pot that Yara placed there. And the fire was not the fire that had killed Tomas and scarred Yara, and it was not the violence that had killed Marco. It was the other fire, the original fire, the fire that cooks food and warms homes and brings people to a table, and it burned in a converted garage in the harbor district like a small, persistent, undefeatable sun. Thank you for staying with Yara and Stefan through every recipe of this story. Thank you for understanding that the kitchen is sacred ground, that feeding people is an act of love, and that the best meals are the ones cooked by scarred hands from inherited recipes in imperfect spaces for people who are hungry. If this story moved you, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who cooks, who feeds people, who knows that a good meal can save your life. Drop a comment telling me, what recipe carries the most meaning in your family? I read every single one. Until next time, remember, the fire that destroys and the fire that cooks are the same fire. It's what you place above the flame that makes the difference.